Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Crimes and Times. Tonight, we're going to talk about a subject that mystifies everybody. I can think about these groups that we're going to discuss way back in my childhood to the current. We have an expert tonight on the subject of cults. Joining us is Janja Lalich, who has written books and studied cults, and she's going to share her expertise with us. Hi, Janja. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Michael. It's good to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about your background and how you wound up in this very specific field of study.
Well, I sort of by circumstance ended up in a cult myself back in the mid-70s. And when I was in for 10 and a half years, and it was a very restrictive group. It was a political cult, so we were supposedly working for social change. And when I got out, I felt like my mind was pretty destroyed. I had already graduated from college with honors. I went to University of Wisconsin. I'd had a Fulbright fellowship. I had traveled around Europe. I wasn't like I was a naive kid. But when I got out of the cult, I felt like I couldn't even read the newspaper, in one sitting. So I eventually got into therapy, got myself back together, moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area where I had been living in the cult. And then I went on to graduate school and got my PhD. And so since, I don't know, for the last 30 some years, I've been studying cults as well as teaching and researching and doing other things. But I basically look at cults and extremist groups, charismatic leadership, things like that.
Interesting. I'm a kind of an armchair social psychologist. I look at everything from the state of mind, why we make decisions, and why people do certain things. Janja, do you consider yourself a victim, as many former cult participants and members do?
Well, I don't use the term victim, but I do feel that I was exploited and taken advantage of and harmed, as were all the other people in the group. I've never used that term victim, but I guess it fits the definition.
Okay, let's go back to that. I'm going to ask you, a number of questions, and if I touch upon a nerve or something that's extremely emotional, I apologize. We'll just back off if that happens. All right. But let's go back to where were you? How old were you? I think you said you were out of college at this point. And how did this all come about? Who did you meet? What state of mind were you in? And kind of tell us how you transitioned from, a very intelligent college grad, not that intelligence is a factor, I know that, but, someone obviously very secure, self-aware, into being lured into a cult.
Okay, so I was about 30, 31 years old. I had just moved to San Francisco after living in Europe for about 4.5 years. So I was new in town. I was making new friends. And through a friend I met the person who ended up recruiting me through one of my roommates. And I would run into her on the street. She lived in our neighborhood, and we would go have coffee and talk about politics. And she's a very interesting woman, very dynamic. This was in the mid-70s, so the Vietnam War had just ended, and people on the left were sort of trying to figure out, well, what should we work on next? And there were a lot of groups at the time recruiting around the country, certainly in the urban areas. So at one point she asked to come over to my house, and came with another friend, a person I knew a little bit, not closely, and invited me to join a study group. And again, study groups were very common at that time. So I was interested. I thought, well, I'll meet new people. And, I sort of had an intellectual bent, so that was interesting to me. And so I joined the study group, and we would be reading things by various revolutionary leaders. And after a few weeks, maybe 6 weeks, that same woman said, "Oh, can I meet you at your house again? And so is coming." So they came over and said, "Well, how do you like the study group, and what have you been learning?" And so this is very typical of most cult groups, that'll have some kind of front group that'll take you through a sort of basic educational process. So in our case, the point of the study group was to get you to see that the only way to make real social change, to have a social revolution, was to have what was called a vanguard revolutionary party. And this all goes back to debates that actually go back to the revolution in Russia. But anyway, I won't get into all that. But anyway, so I said, well, I've learned that the only way you can make revolution is to have, a disciplined vanguard party. And so she said, well, what if I told you we had one? And so I was like, whoa. And so she said, do you think you'd be interested in joining? And I was like, well, yeah. And at the time, I knew that two people that I had become friends with during the time I was in San Francisco, they were also being asked these same things. So it was sort of safe in that sense that other friends were doing it. So I said, sure, I'd be interested in joining. So then she handed me this giant application and said, well, first you have to fill out this application and get approved. So again, this is a typical cult tactic, sort of, put the carrot out there.
Right. And let me ask you a question, because you brought up a point. You said the Vietnam War had ended, people were looking for something to do. So do we have like revolutionaries looking for a cause? Is that what we had? And if it wasn't it'd be something else?
We have progressives and leftists looking for a cause, yes.
Okay. And, you talked about this process, and here you filled an application. You said, it's kind of the process. It sounds like, a very detailed and disciplined way of grooming somebody.
Yes.
To get you involved sort of in this other group, a study group, which sounds very appealing. An application to give it sort of this form of legitimacy. This is kind of what we would see as a fraud going on, when I was in the FBI. We see these steps that people maybe think, ooh, this is very exclusive. I'm lucky to be asked. Is that kind of how you felt looking back at it now?
Exactly. And the application, of course, asked everything about you, your family, your bank accounts, your passport number, what your parents did, what your siblings do. So at that point, they knew everything about you.
Right.
And I thought, well, they're very serious about this. I was told not to tell anyone, and I said, well, why? And they said, well, there's a lot of stuff happening in the Bay Area right now. The Red Squads are out looking for Patty Hearst. This was right at the time right after the SLA had kidnapped Patty Hearst. And so there was a lot of, law enforcement stuff going on in the area. So that made them seem all the more serious to me. And so that was part of the appeal. Like, these weren't just, fly-by-night people. Right. And of course, they did deceive me. They told me it was an international organization, that it was diverse in the demographics, that it was all over the world. And, I eventually found out there were like 25 people, and they were all in the Bay Area.
All right, so tell us about, as you came into the group, how they brought you in, your first meetings, what you thought you were going to be getting involved with, and then how it evolved.
Okay, so initially I was assigned to now lead the study groups that I had just been recruited out of, and I had been given another assignment to do printing. And so one of the houses of some of the members had a mimeograph machine, and so we would mimeo leaflets, and we would do like strike support work and things like that. And at one point, I was asked to, I was joining. They said it didn't have a name yet. I didn't even think to ask if there was a leader. So at one point, my two friends and I were asked to come to one of the houses, and we knocked on the door, and somebody opened the door and said, pick a name, pick a name. And we're like, what do you mean pick a name? They said, just pick a name, pick a first name, and that's your party name from now on. That's the only name you'll use. So we all looked at each other, and we picked a name, and we went inside and sat down. And then this woman came in, this sort of big, heavy-set woman, and plunked down in the couch in front of us and started lecturing us about security. It goes on and on and on about security and how important security is and all these security rules. And then she gets up and leaves the room. And the three of us are looking at each other, and we're like, well, who was that? What was that? And then the others came out and said, well, that was our leader. That's Marlene Dixon. And they gave us some things that she had written. And she had been a sociology professor, oddly enough, and had sort of made a little name for herself in the women's movement. And so we were supposed to be very thrilled, that we had this famous educated leader. And so, things went on from there. I was expected to be on call 24 hours a day. In those days, we had telephones that you would plug into the wall. And if you didn't want to call, you could just unplug the phone. And we were told we couldn't do that anymore in case somebody wanted to reach us. And also, I was, excuse me, I was particularly targeted to quickly move up the ranks. So very shortly after that, I was assigned to be the secretary to the Central Committee. And I would go to these day-long meetings of the Central Committee, which was, I think, about 6
And
or
what were
7.
you meeting about? What, in other words, what was your mission? Were you clear on your mission, or were you still
Well,
trying to understand how the cult worked?
our mission was purportedly to bring about social revolution. And we didn't believe that it would happen in our lifetime, but we saw ourselves as martyrs for the cause, that we were laying the groundwork for an eventual social revolution.
Okay, now as martyrs, are you talking literally or figuratively, or how
Well, figuratively, in the sense that we were dedicating our lives. We went through ceremonies and made pledges, and so we vowed to do this for the rest of our life. And we worked basically 20 hours a day, 20 hours a day, day after day after day, year after year after year. We rarely had days off or vacations. Only the rich members got to like go home and try to get more money out of their families. So we were being martyrs in the sense that we were working like dogs.
Okay, hold on, because I want to again go. So you talked about these ceremonies and rituals. Can you describe those? What was involved in them? Was there any physical beatings? Was sex involved? Was there anything that we had to sort of compromise yourself in order to be accepted?
In those early rituals, basically we were broken up into what were called branch meetings, and this was all modeled after the Communist Party. So maybe 10 or 12 people would be in a branch, as the group grew. And so once you became accepted as a member, you first went through a general member process, and you went through new members classes and all kinds of training and criticisms and writing your life history. Then when you were finally accepted, when you were in your branch meeting, you would stand up, and the leader of the branch, the two leaders of the branch would stand there, and they would read this vow, and you would repeat the vow that you were going to do this for life. And then they would pin a red star on your chest, and then everybody would get up and sing the International. So that was our ritual for becoming a cadre member of the group. We did a lot of singing. We had our own little workers' songbook, and so every meeting ended with singing. And as for sex and beatings, there was some physical beatings that went on, both of people in the group and outside the group, but it was rather rare. It wasn't a common occurrence. There was a group called the Eagles, and we were specially trained by a guy who had been a former Marine. And on Saturday mornings, we went to a park and did calisthenics and whatnot. And so the Eagles were charged with anytime someone was to be expelled, or if we were going to go trash some other lefty's office or something like that. The leader also had guns, and I'd say probably 90% of the members had no idea of that. But she did have guns, and every now and then she would wave a gun around. She was a severe alcoholic, and her behavior was very erratic.
All right, so you're in the situation. You talked about trashing other people's offices or whatever, and people waving guns around. You hadn't done anything, I imagine, at this point severely criminal, but you're obviously starting to engage in criminal conduct. Were you thinking about that? Were you having some sort of cognitive dissonance? Or were you just at that point so ingrained that you felt that, at least in your own mind, you could justify what you and the group were doing?
I would say in the early years, when I was definitely what I would consider a true believer, I justified everything that we did or that the leader did by saying, this is what needs to be done to get the revolution to happen. This is what we've dedicated our life to, and maybe this seems a little odd right now, but it's all for the greater cause.
And what exactly is that greater cause? Was it the overthrow of the U.S. government and the installation of communism? Was it corruption you wanted out of our government? I mean, as you said, the Vietnam War had ended. What was the end game, even if in the long run?
The end game in the long run was socialist revolution. But as I said,
so the overthrow of the U.S. government as we knew it.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Although we didn't put it in those terms. We did internally, but we didn't in any of our literature.
Okay.
We basically said, we were fighting against racism and sexism and things like that, which was our way of recruiting people, because we weren't going to be able to recruit people by saying, oh, we're going to have a communist revolution.
Right.
So there was the background organization and then a lot of different kinds of front groups for recruiting. But in our minds, yes, we ultimately wanted that kind of revolution, although we didn't think we'd be around to see it.
Okay. And you also mentioned, you're working on this thing 20 hours a day, every day. Had you turned all your money over to them, and how were you all existing without holding down jobs?
Well, some people did have jobs. What we had, it was very intricately structured. So we had a finance committee, and the finance committee would figure out how much money was needed to run the organization. And then certain people who already had jobs were told to keep their jobs. Other people were maybe told to go work somewhere else. Other people worked internally to the organization. And everybody lived on the same amount of money, which I think was something like $500 a month. So if you worked at the branch meeting on Friday nights, you turned over everything over $500. And then that money was divvied up to the people who worked internally, and they were given $500 to, for their pay for that month. Of course, a lot of money was funneled to the leader, and she had various bank accounts. And anyone who had an inheritance or anything like that, they were expected to turn all that over to the organization.
And what were you living in an apartment with just a lot of people? What was your environment?
Yes,
Yeah.
we were primarily living in apartments or houses in San Francisco, and those big old Victorians. And we would try to fit as many people as possible into a house to bring the rent down. And sometimes you'd be assigned, you didn't always get to choose where you lived. So sometimes you'd be assigned to live in a house. And then at some point we sent people out around the country. So we had what we called stations in Los Angeles, in Tennessee, in Washington, D.C., in New York, and in Milwaukee. And so we would send like 4 people there to start organizing and recruiting there. And again, they were expected to make it on their own, however they could. They weren't really given any money. So people did whatever they needed to do to be able to live and also pay dues. We also, on top of that, we had to pay dues, monthly dues. So it's kind of ironic.
Yeah. Yeah. So, if we thought about recruiting right now, we'd be talking about social media and getting out there. This is long before social media.
Right.
How did you recruit? How difficult was it? What was your methodology for doing it? So what was your hit rate, so to speak? For every 1,000 people that you spoke to, and the science of it. How did you identify? Because there's always, you're always looking for your mark,
Right.
in what you're doing. How did you
Right.
identify those that you felt you'd be most successful at recruiting?
Well, we generally recruited through various front groups. So we did a lot of political work in the Bay Area. So we had an office, we had an organization called the Grassroots Alliance, and we had at one point 3,000 volunteers with that organization. We were one of the first groups that actually worked in the Black neighborhoods and in the Hispanic neighborhoods. And so we would look for people who looked like they could be brought into the background organization, which in a lot of cases wasn't going to work, because these were like, Black women with kids or Hispanic people who were just trying to survive on their own and weren't going to be able to work 20 hours a day like we did for the organization. So we had different people who worked in, say, factories or, say, the General Hospital. We had like a labor organizing front group called the Rebel Workers Organization. So we would initially recruit into these front groups, and then, as you'd say, target people who looked like they could be recruited up the ranks.
Socially conscious people.
Yeah, or
Someone,
people
maybe.
who.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. What?
Yeah, people who seemed interested, who, we had a newspaper that we would sell, people who like really read the articles in the newspaper, wanted to talk about it, got into good discussions. And then we would usually ask them if they wanted to join a study group. So then they would be brought up to that level, and then from the study group into the party, just as I was, but early on.
Did you look for other criteria? Lonely, maybe new, in an area, maybe some, some sort of enemy in their life, they're lost somehow.
We mostly, I would say, other than co-workers and people like that. We recruited a lot through friendship networks. So, for example, some people moved down from Seattle, and there were two couples who moved down from Seattle. So we ended up recruiting them, and then asked them, urged them to contact their other friends in Seattle and get them to move down. So a lot of it was through friendship networks, which is far more effective than recruiting strangers, because it's a lot harder to say no to someone you know. So in the research we've done, we see that about more than 2/3 of people who are recruited into cults are recruited by a friend, a family member, or a coworker.
Well, that would be similar to what we call affinity fraud, where you're going after people with which you have some sort of connection.
Right.
They're going to trust you. Well,
Right.
one thing that's sticking out to me, you talk about the fact when you recruited people, try to recruit them, you presented it as something else because you don't want to say what we're doing. Once again, did that ring a bell in the back of your mind that, hey, if I can't say exactly what I'm doing, there's something wrong here, and this probably is not going to succeed? Because otherwise, I should be able to say, hey, this is our goal, and people should want to come to us. The fact they had to manufacture, this presentation, didn't that say something to you about the validity of what you were doing?
No, because that was part of our. See, we were a cadre vanguard party. And so this follows the work of Lenin. So that if you believe you're a vanguard party, you believe that you're the brainy ones, you're the enlightened ones, and you're bringing this to the people. And that it's your job to then educate the people and get them to see the value of your belief system. So you wouldn't go right out there and say, like I said earlier, you wouldn't just go right out there and tell them the end game, but you have to sort of soften people and educate them to the point where they'll understand why lying is necessary, or why, beating someone up is necessary, or why, 10 people living in a house is necessary and people living on peanuts. So you can't just go right out there and spill the whole beans, because that won't work. People aren't ready to hear it. That's how we understood it.
And you made yourself believe that.
Yes, I truly believe that. Now, I have to say, there were times from the beginning on, and I think this is true for most cult members, unless they themselves are a psychopath, like most of the leaders are. There are times when things bother you, when you do have cognitive dissonance, and you do wonder, this isn't right. But in my situation, we were so tired that you couldn't entertain those ideas. You didn't have the time to think about it, and you couldn't think straight anyway. When you're working at that pace and you're eating unhealthy food, because we ate a lot of burritos because that's what we could afford. You really aren't thinking straight. So you might have a flash of a thought, and you're also trained to just get rid of those thoughts as soon as you have them, because those are, anti-proletarian or against the revolution or whatever you've been taught, so that you actually internalize the kind of self-criticism and self-punishment for having these bad thoughts. But you do have thoughts all along the way. And then this is how I think people end up leaving. At some point, there's a metaphor people have used that say these things are stacked on a little shelf in the back of your head, and at some point that shelf breaks.
Right.
And that's when you have the aha moment and say, I've got to get out of here. This isn't right. But it takes time.
Yeah, a couple of psychological points you brought up here. You talked about, you believe that you are, the cult members, you feel you're intellectually superior. We have to educate these people below. And we've seen that personality in cult leaders. And do cult leaders truly believe that about themselves, you think? Or do they just get you to believe it so you follow them? Or is it a combination of both?
Well, I would say, first of all, that probably, and this is not a scientific figure, but I would say probably 98% of cult leaders are straight out con artists. Mm-hmm. I don't think they believe their shtick. I think they have figured out how to come up with a good game. They figured out how to come up with something to offer people that a certain number of people are going to respond to. And then if they're smart, they'll set up a good inner circle and lieutenants or middle-level managers, whatever you want to call them, to keep running the show, because cult leaders usually don't do a lot of work. So their initial recruits are important. I think to some degree, depending on how long the cult exists and what the leader's proclivities are to begin with, and what their state of mind is to begin with, I think as time goes on, having that kind of unbridled power with no checks and balances, I think they end up getting more and more disturbed, more and more devious, perhaps more and more violent, perhaps more and more sexual, again, depending on what their proclivity is.
Mm-hmm.
Because people, no one can handle that degree of power. And some of them may have delusions and think they really are, this grand being. I mean, I suppose on some level my leader did think she was the next Lenin, but most of it is about control and exploitation, and basically getting what they want because they're narcissists.
Right. And now you talked about, you were trained and how to recruit. Was this training, at least in your opinion, was it structured, and how they come up with these ideas that worked? Was your leader so brilliant that she was able to create this, or was it more trial by error, or is it just someone, again, that had this natural tendency and ability to con people?
Well, I was in charge of recruitment for much of the years of the organization, so I guess I was the one who was teaching people how to con people.
Okay. So how did you learn that? Yeah.
Well, I think it was trial and error. I mean, basically, every member was expected every week to turn in a recruitment report where they wrote up paragraphs about various friends or coworkers or people they thought they could recruit. So they'd write up who that person was, how they knew them, what they thought maybe their appeal for the party would be, et cetera, et cetera. And then I would review those reports, and I would give instructions back to the recruitment officer in each of those branch meetings, right? And so we would say, yes, Susie Q, you go after John Doe, and he's from a really wealthy family. He'd probably really feels guilty about having all that money because he really wants to he wants to work on social issues. So if you can pressure him a little bit on that point. And I don't know how we did it. I guess it was trial and error, but we just figured out what were people's weak spots, in a sense, or what were their interests that were similar to ours. And we would keep pushing at that until they seemed ready to join.
Okay, so now we have this group, and you said you're out there working to this cause. Other than recruiting and reading and training, what actually were you doing? Were you guys committing crimes? What were you doing to kind of get this revolution going?
Well, as I said, we did a lot of political work in the Bay Area. So, for example, in the 70s, when Prop 13 was passing, which was changing the tax law in California, we worked against that, and we led big protests, and went to City Hall all the time. We ran people for various offices through the Peace and Freedom Party, which was a third party in California. We took over that party so that we could run our candidates. We did a lot of strike work. If some union went on strike, we would go along and help support their strike and use that as a way to recruit. I would say there wasn't so much overt criminal activity. I think there was a certain amount of fraud in how various organizations were set up. We had 3 or 4 different nonprofits, and money was funneled here and there and everywhere. At some point, we took tours to Nicaragua after Nicaragua had the revolution with Sandinista in charge. We then took tours there, and so that was another way we saw that we were educating people into how wonderful socialism could be. We had a publishing house, which I actually ran, and we put out a newspaper every week in English and in Chinese and in Spanish. That people were required to sell a certain amount every week. We had 2 academic journals that we published. We published books. So all of that was part of our distribution and the spreading of our education. That's how we saw it.
So in the long run, even though you thought this may not happen in your lifetime, how did you envision this revolution? Was it an intellectual revolution whereby people like yourself would be in office and slowly inculcate the United States into socialism, or did you see an armed revolution? How did this transition in your mind going to take place?
In the future,
Yes,
I think yes.
ultimately.
Yeah. We believed it would be an armed revolution.
And we
As,
doing
as we were followers in a sense of Chairman Mao, and Chairman Mao always said the revolution isn't a tea party. And so we believed ultimately it would have to be an armed revolution. But again, we didn't see that happening in our lifetime.
Why not? Why didn't you see that happening in your lifetime?
Because America was too big, and the people would need to be brought to such a degree of education that there was no way we could see that happening given the size that we were.
Oh, so you thought just by your sheer numbers you would grow, and therefore that would give you the physical strength
Yeah.
to have an armed revolution.
I think the idea was that eventually we would merge with other groups that had similar ideas as ours, although, of course, we were also extremely sectarian, so we hated all other groups just as they hated us. But
right.
We thought that eventually we would merge with other groups, and this idea would spread, and the education would spread, and the raising of the awareness of the working class in America would, decades and decades and decades from now, get to that point.
All right. So tell us about your aha moment. What happened? Did something occur? Or was it just something that snapped in your brain? And how did you make a decision? And then what happened from that moment on?
Well, it's kind of a complicated story. So my aha
Over
moment.
here.
Okay. My aha moment came when, in 1981, I found out that my mother was ill in the hospital back in Milwaukee. That's where I was from originally. And so I borrowed money from the organization and I flew home. And long story short, she had a glioblastoma, a brain tumor. And they operated and said, even though they operated, she would have maybe 4 months to live because it would just grow right back. So I contacted my leadership in the organization and I said, let me stay here until my mother dies. It's like 4 or 5 months, and then I'll come back because she has nowhere to go. And my leadership said, I have to check with, Comrade Big Shot. And then she called me back and said, oh, we have a great idea. Bring your mother to San Francisco. So like a good militant, I said, okay. And I went back and arranged, one of my roommates moved out so that my mother could move in, and my mother came out. And my mother was a Serbian woman who had hardly ever left Milwaukee. Her church was very important to her. She was not, she had a high school diploma, but she was, a simple woman. So she comes out to San Francisco, lives in my house, and I never see her because I'm working from 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. So at some point I asked the organization, you had me bring my mother out here, but I never see her. And they said, oh, well, you can go home and have dinner with her. So I'd get to go home and have like 45-minute dinner with her every evening. Then they decided she should work while she was here. So they had her working at one of our front groups at the Grassroots Alliance, which was a public office. And someone else would come and one of the militants would pick her up and take her there. And she, I don't know, did filing, or I don't really know what she did there. And then they'd bring her home. So that was the end of my dinners with her. So one night I came home at about 11 o'clock and I found my mother dead in her bedroom on the floor. And it was absolutely devastating for me. And I called my best friend who came over, and then I called my leadership and I said, my mother just died and I'm having her body flown home. And on the other end of the line, this woman says, well, you're not going home for the funeral, are you? And that's when I snapped. And I thought, here I am. I'm busting my ass day after day after day, year after year, to build a so-called better world. And if this is the better world we're building, then I'm told I can't go to my mother's funeral. There's something wrong with this. So I borrowed money again and I went home and I organized the funeral. I don't remember any of it. It was like a haze to me. And the big dinner afterwards, which Serbians tradition after a funeral. And in the middle of the dinner, I got up and left because I had a flight back to San Francisco, a night flight. And I was just, I was in a haze. So as soon as I got back, they called me to a meeting, and there was a meeting with the top leadership. So it was maybe 25, 30 people. And I got criticized. You had to like sit in the front of the room and everybody would criticize you. And I got criticized for putting my mother ahead of the revolution. And how dare I do that? And, you know, how petty bourgeois that was of me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I was demoted, and I had to go around to all the other branches and confess my sins and be an example. And after that, whenever someone wanted to go home, I was sent to talk to them, to talk them out of it. And after that point, I was completely numb, and I absolutely hated my existence, but I couldn't figure out how to get out. And I would get up every morning and I'd take a shower and I would cry in the shower because we weren't allowed to cry. We were supposed to be these steeled, emotionless people. And I'd cry in the shower and I'd get in my car to go to my facility. And in the car, I used to just wish every day, I would get killed in a car accident because it was the only way I could see to get out.
Well, let me ask you this, because it sounds like you had a certain amount of freedom and you weren't living like in a camp where they,
Right.
you know, again, beat you. Yeah, you didn't have much money invested anymore. You only carried, what, $500 most of the time.
Right.
Why couldn't you just drive away?
Why didn't I drive away?
Yeah.
Well, I would think about driving away. And I had maybe $100. I had a broken down old car. I didn't know if my car would make it over the Bay Bridge. And I would think about, where will I go? Will I go to Reno? What will I do there? And we were ingrained with the idea that if we left, we would like die in the street like dirty communists, that no one would want us, no one would accept us. So part of that is working on my mind. And I'm thinking, you know, how will I survive out there? I don't know anyone anymore. Both my parents are dead. I have nowhere to go. I have no one to trust. Other people had left the group, but you couldn't trust that you could go to them because even people who had left would turn people in. And I knew they'd come after me because we did go after people if they left, if they were high level, because I knew a lot of party secrets.
And what does that mean? What does that mean, go after them?
We would go and retrieve people. One guy left and went home to Illinois, and we went to his house to get him.
And you kidnapped him?
Well, that one didn't work. The father slammed the door in our faces, but okay. we did bring other people back. We'd put them on trial.
Wait, you brought them back by force or by coercion?
By force and by coercion. Throw them in a car, bring them back, sit them in a chair, put them on trial, place them under house arrest. They'd have to, and this is what people don't understand. It's like they didn't lock you in your house, or one person was held in a basement for I can't remember how long, and different people would stand guard. But you can't. You're psychologically paralyzed. You can't. The door is there, but you can't go out the door. The fear is so overwhelming. The fear of the outside world and the fear of what the group is going to do to you. So you're like frozen. I don't know how else to explain it.
No, I think people do understand, you know, that psychological torment and control that cults have played on people through various means.
Right.
Right. All right. So go ahead. You're telling us about, you know, when you had the movement. Go ahead.
So I was miserable, and as it turns out, a lot of people were miserable. At this point, the cult was maybe down to about 150 people, and some of those were out.
From a high of how many?
I would say of the internal organization, maybe the high was 500. The front groups had thousands, as I said.
Right.
But the internal cadre organization probably never got bigger than 300. So by this time, it's down to 150, and most of us are the ones who got recruited in the first year or two. So that means that we've been there the longest, we worked the longest, but we also got the most intense indoctrination, because as years went on, we didn't do the same kind of indoctrination that we did early on. So the classes and all those kinds of things. So it's sort of another complicated story, but essentially the leader had decided that she wanted to get rid of the outer rings of the organization, the riffraff, as she called them. So we were sitting in these leadership meetings with her, and she'd say, I want to get rid of the riffraff, and I just want to take the people with money and the intellectuals and go to Washington and start a think tank. And so in in our minds, and of course we didn't talk about this with each other, but you're thinking, this is really terrible. These general members, these other levels of members, they've devoted their lives as much as we have, and she wants to just like throw them in the river. So that was troubling people. And at the time, it's a long story, but at the time, we were leaving, two of us were leaving to go to the International Book Fair in Frankfurt for our publishing house. And the night before, a lot of really insane stuff happened with the leader. And because she wanted to, she became enamored with Bulgaria, and that was her dream paradise. And she was going to go to Bulgaria after we went to Frankfurt. And she wanted to take a computer, which was against the law. At that time, it was still the Iron Curtain, and it was against the law to take any kind of electronic equipment across the Iron Curtain. But she wanted to do it anyway. So the lawyers our own lawyers had to figure out how this was going to work. And anyway, we were all up all night, and it was crazy. And I got on the plane that next morning. We were leaving at 5 a.m. and with one of my comrades, and we got on the plane. And the minute they shut the door to the plane, we both looked at each other and said, "We're in a cult." And we started crying. And we went to Frankfurt, we went to the book fair, we started looking for jobs. At night, we'd go to a beer hall and we'd drink beer and eat Frankfurters and cry and tell each other our stories and figure out how we could escape. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the leader was leaving for Bulgaria, and she was at her house with her inner circle, whoever was left from the inner circle, maybe 10 people. She left for the airport, and the 10 people left at her house all looked at each other and said, "Oh my God, we're in a cult." And they started crying. So simultaneously, we all just kind of broke at that moment. And while she was out of the country, she was gone for, I think, 2 weeks. And while she was out of the country, we called together all the members from all around the country. We called together people who'd been recently expelled, and we told them what was happening. And it took 3 days to convince people that we weren't just trying to have a coup, that we were telling the truth. That she was corrupt, that she was a drunk, that all the things written in her name we actually wrote, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then this whole kind of speaking bitterness thing happened, where people were talking about things they did to survive, how they sold their blood so they could pay for their newspapers, how they never saw their children, et cetera. And the night before she came back, we took a vote, and we voted unanimously to expel her and to dissolve the organization. And that was it. So it's a very unusual ending for a cultic group, but one we're kind of proud of.
And what did you do after that?
Well, I decided to go to New York because I thought I could get a job in publishing, because I had learned that skill in the cult. And so I got myself to New York. I got a job. I eventually got into therapy and got myself, feeling normal again, and then started researching this to figure out what had happened to me.
And you study cults now, right? And you write
Yes.
about them.
Yes. I've written, I think, 5 or 6 books. I have a new one that just came out, and I'm still I'm retired from teaching now, but I'm still very involved with cult education.
Yeah, looking back at my childhood, there's a couple of ones I have to ask you about. One, I remember walking around Manhattan, Hare Krishna. You remember them? Now,
Sure.
I remember they seemed pretty harmless. What can you tell me about them? Did you ever study them? Do you know what the basis of their existence was? What was their raison d'etre?
Well, the Krishnas were a Hindu group. The leader was from India, but he came to America to recruit. They were supposed to be celibate monks. They had to get permission to marry. So they didn't reproduce much, but some of them did have kids. The kids got sent to schools in India that were very harsh. And there was a lot of sexual and physical abuse. At some point, the leader, Prabhupada, died, and he left. The organization was huge. It was one of the more successful in recruiting in the 70s and 80s. If people remember, they're the ones who wore the orange robes and sold books in the airports and chanted in the streets.
I remember they offered this gooey food as I was walking by, and this thing, we're all dipping their hands in it and licking. I'm like, I don't want any of that. you know.
But they would have these big free dinners, and it was one of the way they recruited. You know, they'd find lonely people who needed something to eat, and that's how they drew them in. So after the leader died, he left it to his 12 disciples. So now there's different groups around the country, led by different people, and depending on which group you're in, you may have a better or worse time. There have been scandals associated with the Krishnas back in the 80s or 90s, where there were some murders and one of the leaders went to jail. All the leaders are white Americans; they're not Indian. And then there was a class action lawsuit against the organization done by the children who had gone to those schools, and that was a really big deal. They settled that suit. The suit was filed in Texas, and the suit got settled, and people had to sign a document saying that they would never sue again, and everybody. And so in order to get, like, I think it was $1,500, some very small amount of money, you had to sign this document. So some did and some didn't. The Krishnas have now tried to clean up their image and reconstitute in some ways, but as far as I'm concerned, it's still not a healthy organization. They consider women second-class citizens. Women have no rights. The woman has to walk, 10 paces behind her man. And yeah, it's probably at this point one of the more benign groups, but in my opinion, it's still a controlling group.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't even know they existed. I just remember them from my days in New York when I was going to college. So I was, in my late teens, early 20s. They seemed, at the surface, they seemed like hippies. Just saw this peace-loving group. But at that point, I had no idea of what was going on behind the scenes.
Right.
Because I didn't even know they were still around. One cult, again, I have to ask you about, and everyone knows about this one. But again, from the time it happened, Charles Manson. Of course, we all know he's been in the news. What was, and we could spend the whole show on that, I'm sure. It was such a phenomenon, and with the book Helter Skelter. But what was it about Charles Manson that made his movement so successful when they were so violent and did these brutal murders? How did he succeed in terms of, attracting these followers? And again, we have to remind the audience, we're talking about a time long before social media, where you had to go on the street and recruit people just by word of mouth.
Right.
What did he have? What made him so successful in recruiting people into this crazy cult?
Well, I think it was a confluence of the era, the hippie era, and drugs, and some people sort of losing their way in that time of curiosity. And so he recruited basically by coming on to girls, getting them to come to his. Eventually, they settled in that ranch in the valley outside LA. He used a lot of drugs on people, and that is actually quite unusual. There's very few groups that actually use drugs. But he would, have people drop LSD, and then he would make love with some woman, and, she would see God or whatever you do when you're on LSD. And so it was a lot of sex and drugs. And, I don't know if I'd call him successful. His group wasn't all that large in terms of recruitment. And then, of course, he ordered people to go out and murder various families. And he was a wannabe rock musician. Right. And actually, one of my theories is that there are quite a few cult members who are wannabe rock musicians. So I don't know if there's some pattern there, but
some need for recognition, some need to have people, pawing over you and just oohing you to death. I mean, I guess that would be it, right?
Right. So, but he was really a racist, actually, and the whole point of all of that was to start a race war, which I think a lot of people don't think about it in that way.
So Helter Skelter was this ultimate race war,
right?
Right, that he would eventually walk in when it was over and take over.
Right, exactly. So he was able to, with whatever people saw in him, charisma I say in one of my earlier books, charisma is in the eye of the beholder. So somebody that I think is charismatic, you might think is, the dullest person on earth. So charisma is a relationship, and not everyone's going to respond the same way. So often people look at cult leaders and they're like, what did they see in that person? But it's a social bond. It's a personal bond.
Right, and we have to remember, again, even prior to social media, these guys would go out there and however they met, whether it's a college campus or walking on the street, they may
Yeah.
recruit 2 people, but they may have spoken to thousands in the course of a day who
Right.
just blew them off. So if you just
Right.
keep at it, again, you're saying, we really didn't recruit that many people. But if you think about how many people didn't go to him, you realize, well, he was only charismatic or attractive to a small amount of those who were exposed to him.
Right.
All right, so who are you studying today, and what do we know about cults today? And what do you see sort of as the underlying commonality in these different cults?
Well, first of all, today there are more cults than ever before, because there are ones that have been around for decades, and then every week I learn of new ones. I mean, it's impossible to keep up. A lot of that was the influence of the New Age movement. So all of those ideas of angels and talking with ascended beings and sort of glomming onto the Native American traditions, with sweat lodges and all that kind of thing. One of my big concerns is cults in the workplace. There are a lot of these New Age training programs that are extremely cultic in the techniques that they use. And they're coercive and take a lot of money from people. And
This is in the workplace.
In the workplace,
and they're bound upon that a little bit.
Well, these are these programs that are, they're touted as management training programs or leadership training programs. And ideally, from the cult's point of view, you get a boss who thinks this is wonderful, and then he or she starts sending everyone from the company. So it's a lot of money for the workshop, and it starts bringing these techniques back into the workplace. And so a lot of these are they use a lot of what I call high arousal techniques, where you get people worked up and you get people to divulge things about themselves and sharing personal information, which is inappropriate in the workplace. So many big companies in America, including the government, are using some of these courses. And people go to them because they feel they have to because of their job or whatever. They're afraid, they'll lose their job or everyone will think they're weird because they don't go. And so it can sometimes cause rifts in the workplace. So that is one concern of mine. The other concern...
I haven't heard of that. And is it prevalent? And I know you don't want to mention names, but are these companies or training programs something we would have heard of if you were to mention them?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
And what is their goal? What is the goal of the group providing this training? Are they trying to, again, compromise people? Are they trying to get their identities for fraud? What is their goal, or is it just a scam?
I'd say for most of them, the goal is money, and it's a scam. It's money and recognition. The more companies that hire them, they can put on their brochure, oh, I've been hired by GM, by GE, by whatever, by the U.S. Army, and so it lends to their legitimacy. And then just like any other cult, they'll look for people in these audiences who they can then recruit onto staff and then perhaps into the inner circle. So the inner circle of most of these, the top levels, operate as cults. The other, and other people out there, they might say, well, I don't care if it's a cult in the inner circle. I go to these weekend workshops and they're really helping me, but out there. And my other concern is the number of suicides among the children who have been born and raised in cults. And that's the subject of my latest book, where I interviewed 65 people who were born or raised in a cult. And they were from 39 different cults, and pretty much evenly men and women. And I looked at both their life while they were in the cult, but primarily what I wanted to look at was how did they survive when they got out? Because most of them were raised in very restrictive cults. So they get out into the world, and they might be 40 years old, or they might be 17 years old, depends on when they can get themselves out. But they don't know how the real world functions. They don't know how to most of them don't have any education, so they don't know about getting a GED. They don't know how to apply for school. They don't know how to get any help. They don't know where to go. There aren't resources like there are domestic violence shelters, that finally, as a society, we woke up about that and we have resources for abused women. Well, we need to do a similar thing for the children of cults, because they're really hurting and they're not understood and they're not finding the right help, and the suicides are rampant.
Interesting. You just remind me of a question I wanted to ask you. Going back early in the conversation when your mom died and you wanted to go back home and they discouraged you from doing that. Was their discouragement because they just didn't want to lose your time, away when you should be working? Or was it part of that theory of always trying to cut you off from your family, your other influences, and they were afraid of you going back and, meeting with your mother and maybe meeting other people who would make you see the light? Which one do you think it was?
I'm sure it was both. I mean, I'm sure they thought if I stayed there, I'd already been there for like 6 weeks, and I'm sure they thought if I stayed for 4 months, I'd probably never come back. And that would have been a big blow, because I was in leadership, and anytime someone in leadership left, that had a ripple down effect on the other members. And that also, I had important jobs. I was running the publishing house. I was doing things like that. Not that I couldn't have been replaced, but I think it's more that they never wanted to lose anyone who was competent and capable. They didn't mind losing people who were, sloughing off or not doing their work or causing trouble or sick all the time. But if you were competent and capable, they wanted to keep you.
Right. The reason I asked you about being a victim, and you're kind of alluding to that now, is prior to you, coming on the show, I spoke with about 4 or 5 people who had been victims of cults, and all of them involved sexual exploitation, and ultimately people decided they didn't want to come on and really talk about it. So are you still finding that as a big part of that control factor in these cults?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Cult leaders are about money, sex, or power, or combination. And, sex is one of the most intimate ways you can control someone, whether it's having sex with them or telling them not to have sex or whatever it might be. So sexual abuse, to all out assaults and rapes is more than common in a lot of these groups. And that was one of the things I also found in my interviews with the children, that many of them had been sexually abused, often by relatives, and many of them had been physically abused. The emotional and psychological abuse, well, that's a given. But I think people don't realize the extent of the physical and sexual abuse that goes on, and especially of the children.
And geographically, are we finding these more in the suburban, rural areas as opposed to the cities where they have these compounds and places where they could get more privacy?
They're everywhere. They're in the cities. They're in the country. And they're all around the world. I don't want to seem like someone who sees a cult under every bush, but there are thousands of them. And the hardest ones to find out about and to help, and the hardest ones to leave, are the small, what I call the no-name cults, or the family cults, where there's just a small group of people with one leader. Similar to the family which made the news here in California earlier in the year, the family that had their 10 children shackled and kept in the house for years and years and years. Well, that was a family cult. That guy thought he was some kind of god, and they had to treat him as a god. And it had all the signs of what I call a family cult. And those cases we never learn about until something tragic happens.
So somebody's out there in a cult now, we know about it. How can we help?
Well, if it's someone if it's someone you personally know, the best thing to do is get yourself educated first. Find out everything you can about that cult. Try to find people who've been in that cult. And then decide if you want to try to intervene on your own, or if you want to hire a professional interventionist. Those are tough decisions. you certainly don't want to confront the person and say, hey, you're in a cult. You have to be very tactful. You have to slowly provide information if you have contact with the person. Other than that, I think that the most important thing is media like this, like us continuing to educate the public so that people know what to look for, so people don't stigmatize and make fun of cults and cult members. This is it's a serious public health issue, really, and the more the public can see the complexity of these organizations and how someone gets caught up and how difficult it is to leave, and not just see it as, some scandalous thing that happens on TV for a couple of nights and then it's over. So I think ongoing educational programs like this one, like ones that have been on TV lately, good movies, is probably the best thing we can do at this point.
And also, you made an interesting point about all the help we have for victims of domestic abuse. What's interesting is when I hear what domestic abuse victims tell me, it's very similar to what we're saying here in terms of the way they control their victims, and mind control, sometimes physical intimidation, cutting off from the family. It's very similar ways of keeping people stuck. And we always say to people, oh, why don't you just walk away? Why don't you just leave? Because most of us don't understand the mind control or that intimidation factor that's already occurred over a period of time.
Right. No, there's absolutely a connection there.
Right. So if someone is out there and they want help, what is the best thing for them to do? Call 911. What's the best thing they should do to get out if they're afraid?
Oh, if someone's in a cult?
Yes, and they want to get out. What would we tell them?
Well, if they have any family who are not in the cult, who they think they can go to, otherwise, and depending on, if they're physically hurt, obviously they should get themselves to a hospital or call 911. I think educating first responders is another important thing we can do, so that they recognize, the symptoms. But I think doing whatever they can do to get out. Again, it's going to depend. Are they in the city? Are they in the country? Do they have any money? Trying to find friends or relatives is probably the best thing to do, so that this is why I always tell families, if they have someone who joins a cult, it's like, don't criticize them, and always let them know that they have a safe haven they can come to, because it's the hardest thing they're ever going to do. They're giving up their whole world. And so if they know they can come home, and you're not going to laugh at them, and you're not going to make fun of them, and you're not going to say, see, I told you so, but you're just going to welcome them and make them feel safe. That's the best thing you can do.
Yeah, we've had other programs where we've talked about first responders and medical professions who are trained to recognize child abuse and other factors, and teachers. We talk about understanding some of the red flags of kids who may be getting violent when we worry about school shootings. And this probably is another training opportunity for teachers, medical staff, first responders to just maybe somehow recognize the signs of mental abuse.
Yes,
that's out there. That could be whether it's domestic violence or a cult or something else, and knowing how to ask the right questions and get them in an environment where they're free to say, yes, please get me out of here.
Yes, and it's similar to human trafficking, which is we're gaining more awareness about that. But again, the tactics used are very similar.
Yeah. All right. Before we let you go, tell us about your book and where we can find it. Your most recent book.
Okay, it's called Escaping Utopia. Growing up in a cult, getting out and starting over. And it's by me and my co-author, Carla McLaren. It was published by Routledge, but it's also available on Amazon, or I'm sure you can order it at your local bookstore or whatever. But it's very readable. It's not an academic book. It's meant for the general public and for people who've had this kind of experience.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise. And we don't know, you may have saved some lives out there for someone who's listening. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Have a good day.
We'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight on Crimes and Times. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you enjoyed the show. I thought that was a fascinating topic. As always, please go to our Facebook page, give us a like, please share, and please go to YouTube and subscribe. Hit that little bell icon and subscribe. We're very close to getting to that magic number, which will allow us to increase the number of platforms that we transmit on, and we have a growing audience, and we thank you for all your support. I'm Michael Tabman from Crimes and Times. Good night.